guys. I'm so glad to have you here with us. And we're going to end on a personal and I hope uplifting note. But given the severity of what's happening today, I wanted to first just jump right in and touch an issue that you and I both have weighed in on the last couple of days. So today, you said that the death of George Floyd was a public execution. This morning, I quoted the Washington Post that had a pretty powerful editorial that said, you know, there are no police protocols for putting your leg, your knee on somebody's neck until they pass out. In fact, it's really a protocol for homicide, not anything to do with law enforcement. And yesterday, I wanted to take a second to read your tweet. You said, here's the sad reality. What happened to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Kristen Cooper has gone on for generations in the Black America. Cell phones have just made it more visible, and dismantling systemic racism in our nation starts with demanding justice and holding offenders accountable. Before you came on, Senator, I mentioned your background in law enforcement as a prosecutor, as the Attorney General for the state of California, and now, of course, as a senator. Tell us what you're thinking and what you think we should be doing at a time like this.
Thank you, Valerie. I just want to thank you for inviting me to join you this afternoon and for all your leadership. And you continue to always uplift everybody, but with a particular emphasis always on women. And I just want to thank you for that sisterhood and all that you do. So thank you.
Right back at you.
You know, in terms of what I said about cell phones, you know, listen, when you know, we think we've had them forever, but they're pretty new, right? And what they are now is that in our smartphone we have the ability to record audio and video. And so what we've seen in the last several years is that what we have known for generations, which communities have known for generations, the rest of the world now is seeing. But it was really interesting, Valerie, because people would say to me, Kamala, what's happening all of a sudden with all this police excessive force? And I said, you know, you sound like a colonist. Like, because you're seeing it for the first time, you think you discovered it. This has been going on for generations. And now people are finally seeing it. So whereas communities and individuals were crying out, were shouting out, were demanding justice, and none appeared, now it is being forced. And thank God. And thank God that we now have the backup to, but sadly, that it wasn't the voices and the word of the people who have known it forever that were taken seriously to implement justice. But now this is what we have. And I'll tell you, I mean, the tragedy of his death, he should not have died. He should not have died. You look at Ahmaud Arbery, and this young man was just jogging. He was just in the neighborhood. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, oh yeah, when we take evening walks, if we see some construction where we live in suburbia and see something happening in a house down the street, we always peek in.
Absolutely.
Right? You look at Breonna Taylor, and I talked to her mother. This is a young woman who became an EMT, an emergency medical technician, because she wanted to help people. Her mother said she would always go and take care of her grandmother and bring her food before she passed. She was a natural caregiver, and she became an EMT because she thought that was the best step, where she could see how she could help people on the street responding to an emergency before she became a nurse, which was her life's dream, right? And so what this points out yet again is that America has got to confront its history of law enforcement being implemented in certain communities and in many situations in a way that has been abusive, that has based on racism and racial profiling, and we need to address it, and we need to make sure there's accountability where those abuses occur, and that's in the best interest of everybody, including law enforcement.
Well, exactly. Everyone deserves to go home safe. Well, as you know, in the Obama administration, President Obama impaneled a task force that created a series of recommendations, 21st century policing recommendations for how to bridge the gap of trust between communities of color and law enforcement. what do you think the Justice Department should be doing now? Because you mentioned how important it is for people to have faith in the system, and they don't. And I'll just say to you that I've had my white friends say to me over the last few years, what is this talk that happens in the Black community? And I realized, oh my goodness, what comes as second nature to us, we've kind of kept quiet because it's embarrassing and humiliating to have to raise our Black boys into young men and grown men who know that there's a different standard for us. They can't do what their white colleagues do when they're teenagers. They can't smart off to the police. We have a very strict lecture that we give over and over and over again. And now that we have these cell phone cameras, the general public is seeing, as you said, Senator, what we've known all along. But what should the Justice Department be doing right now to address this issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, one, they should be, first of all, under Donald Trump's administration, what you all did with the Obama administration was when Attorney General Holder was in place, he implemented so many of the policies that were about my brother's keeper, about 21st century policing, to require that there would be a greater level of awareness and training, and a requirement of that for law enforcement around things like racial bias. The other thing that under the Holder Justice Department, what ended up happening is that they took seriously the importance of investigating patterns and practice of discrimination and abuse coming from police departments. What we should do going forward is resuscitate that, because under the Trump administration, they've essentially gotten rid of those investigations. And we should also extend them, frankly, and I say this as a former prosecutor, not only to police departments, but also to DA's offices and state's attorney's offices, in terms of any patterns or practices of discrimination and abuse by prosecutors. The other thing that needs to happen is that we need to have the enforcement of consent decrees. So as you know, what those are is that a court had decided in cases that there was abuse or misconduct, that there would need to be an implementation of reforms. And that's a consent decree where courts could then supervise whether the reforms were put in place. This administration, the Trump administration, under Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has essentially closed all of those down. So there is literally a lack of accountability from what should be the highest law enforcement office in the land, the United States Department of Justice, to require law enforcement in America to do the right thing, and where there is misconduct, to face the consequence. So going forward, we need not only a new president, we need a new attorney general, and we need to resuscitate what the Obama administration did and build on that groundbreaking work.
Well, speaking of historical patterns that are now coming to the light, an area that you know that the United States of Women is joint venturing with When We All Vote, both 501c3 corporations, both of them nonpartisan, but committed to ensuring that women are helping make sure that everyone who is eligible to vote can vote. And long before this pandemic, we knew in Black communities, Latinx, people with disabilities, there were onerous challenges with waiting in long lines and outright practices that were hostile, that treated people with disparate conditions. And so I know that you are sponsoring an important piece of legislation, the Voting Safe Act. Could you talk a little bit about what it would do and why it is particularly important now? Thank
you. So, all of us who have been involved in campaigns for years and wanting to encourage people to exercise their right to vote, have always had as a challenge to remind people of why they should vote. So in a presidential race, we'll talk about the importance of the United States Supreme Court, the importance of fighting for women's right to choose what happens to their body in terms of their reproductive health care, things of that nature. We would remind people of why they should vote. Well, now, in the midst of this pandemic, we also have the challenge of making sure that when people do vote, they are safe when they vote. So we came up with the Vote Safe Act, which essentially would do three things. One, create incentives for states to put in place vote by mail. We have it in California. In many states, we have vote by mail with no excuses. I mean, you don't need an excuse to get a ballot to vote by mail. You want to vote by mail, you just get it, the ballot, and then if you're eligible to vote. And so we want to put that in place. We want to make sure that people can also, and Alex Padilla, by the way, the Secretary of State of California, has done an excellent job in terms of also putting in place systems so that you can track when you put your ballot in the mail after you voted, that you can track to know where it is. So you don't have to worry about it getting lost or anything like that, because some people are worried about that. And many states have done the same thing. Second, we want early voting. So 20 days. People can vote at least 20 days before the election, so you can do it according to what's best for your schedule. And then the third thing is, if there are places where there's not vote by mail or folks insist on going to the polls, let's make sure they can be safe. So things like curbside voting, things like requiring states to put in place a standard wait time. So unlike Wisconsin, where folks were standing in line for 2 or 3 hours and 50 people got COVID-19, including poll workers, instead, a state would say people should only have to stand in line for a certain number of minutes, and then put the resources so that nobody would stand in line for more than those number of minutes. And in addition to what you said, which is also dealing with long-standing disparities, such as our voters with disabilities, making access better for them, our indigenous people and our Native American brothers and sisters, and making sure that they who don't have a post office address still have a means to vote by mail and remote voting, and so that we can make sure every vote is weighed in and counts in an election, and especially this election where there's so much at stake.
Well, we couldn't agree with you more. In fact, a few weeks ago, our former First Lady, Michelle Obama, who is the driving force and founder behind When We All Vote, really called on Congress to make sure that we do have vote by mail. And I'll pause on that for a second, because we know there are those who are mentioning that vote by mail will increase the amount of voter fraud. And there has been study after study after study that has proven that voting by mail does not cause voter fraud.
That's right.
And also, interestingly, studies that show that it doesn't favor Democrats or Republicans, which is why, as a nonpartisan 501c3, we feel very comfortable advocating for it. And just look at the military. They've been voting by mail since the Civil War. And as you mentioned, Senator, certainly many states have it, and it shouldn't have to explain why. You should just be able to do it, particularly with this pandemic hovering over us. But even without it, we should be making it easy to vote by mail.
That's
On
right.
the early vote, we called for that long before there was a pandemic, because many people can't take off on election day. They have jobs that don't afford them that luxury. Or you have a sick child, or you're sick, or you have an exam and you can't, or you just forget. And given that in the last presidential election, something like 100 million eligible voters didn't vote, we're all about trying to make it as easy as possible. And we also think in every single state, you should be able to register to vote online. With technology being what it is, there'll be just one less impediment to making sure that people are able to get out and vote. So we thank you for the legislation. Anything more that we can do, or those who are listening can do, to help support your important legislation, please let us know what we should be doing.
Can I add one thing on that point?
Please.
Which is, those of us who have been voting by mail, let's share with others who don't have a vote by mail system what it's really like, so we can demystify it, because of all those people who are trying to suggest that it is a bad process. Vote by mail means that you sit at your kitchen table with a cup of coffee and get to go through each one and talk with whoever is your significant other, or call somebody on the phone, or look at the newspaper and say what your favorite editorial board endorsed. And then you just put it in the mail, and vote by mail, when it's done right, is no postage is required. And I say all that because we need to remind people of the ease of voting by mail. Also because, as you and I both know, who have walked across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, commemorating Bloody Sunday with the great John Lewis, and you were there with our president, Barack Obama, we also know that so many of us know that we stand on shoulders of those who fought and died and shed blood for our right to vote. So we feel it our responsibility to go to the polls on election day to honor that sacrifice and that fight. And what I'd like to remind people of is, you can honor the ancestors by voting by mail. You can honor the ancestors by voting by mail. So let's come up with new traditions, like we have sold to the polls. Let's come up with new traditions around voting by mail, because the most important thing that all those women who fought for women to vote, all those folks who fought for Black folks to vote, well, the most important thing they want to know is that we vote.
Yes, and that we vote safely. And as this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and as you mentioned, those of us who celebrated the sacrifices for those who crossed the Edmund Pettit's Bridge over 55 years ago. We know how important it is that we vote. And I think one of the challenges that the United States of Women has taken on working with When We All Vote is we know that women can be very influential in their community. So we're asking them to form voting squads, get your friends, your neighbors, your family together, register 3 people that weren't. And as you said, talk about why it's relevant. What are the issues that you care most about? And who are the candidates that will fight for those issues? And a big point that we make, Senator, is that this initiative isn't about one election or one issue or one candidate. Because as you well know, it matters who's in local government, who's the mayor, who's the local prosecutor, who is in the state legislature drawing the important lines, who is the sheriff, who is in Congress providing the important check and balance and determining the resources that are distributed. And so raising the education, just as we have done around the census, something else that you can do online, you don't have to leave your home to do, that has a direct impact. And I think it's really up to those who are the influencers to help people understand why it's relevant. Because a lot of people look at Washington, as you and I both know, and they just go, oh my gosh, you know, the sausage is just too painful. And so we have to break it down and we have to make it relevant to them.
That's right.
So speaking of voting, I think in a sense, this pandemic has laid bare some of the challenges and importance of state and local and federal government. It's been an excruciating civics lesson, if you will. And I know that you are so acutely aware of the disparities. We have disparities in terms of how this illness is affecting the Black community with far worse outcomes, communities where there are tight concentrations of people living together, communities that are poor. And there has been, and I've seen it here, I'm in New York right now, and I've seen the disparity front and center, disparity in testing. And I know this is an issue that you've spoken quite eloquently to. So give us your thoughts on testing and what we can do to close those disparity gaps.
Right. And thank you. I've come up with, and we've got a lot of support for what we're calling the Racial Disparities Task Force, which is putting in place, and we need support to get it through, but putting in place a requirement that the Health and Human Services Agency will convene a bunch of folks that include community folks, elected leaders, to track where are the racial disparities and demographic disparities, and in particular, who has needs that are not being met, and collect the data to tell us where those folks are. Why? Because then the next thing we want to do with that data is make decisions about where the resources go based on who need them, and do it in a way that is smart for testing, for treatment, and also, you know, God willing, we will have a vaccine. It's going to be a while, but when we have it, we know it's not going to be in mass production. We will not produce enough for 330 million people immediately. So we want to make sure that the people who are getting the vaccine are the people who need it, not just the people who have access to power and resources. So this is part of what we need to do, and that's about a distribution of resources based on need, and also not leaving it to your point, to the governors who have been extraordinary leaders in so many places, to fight against each other in a bidding war to have the test that they need, because the federal government has been, you know, basically absent in terms of its leadership to look at the overall needs of the country as a whole.
Well, and we have to, you know, we have to learn from the past. I will say one of the observations I would make is the experience that the Obama administration had with H1N1 and with Ebola, with Zika, taught us a lot. And as a result, we set up an office in the National Security Council focusing on pandemics. We funded the CDC to have offices around the world, so they were right there on the ground. So when outbreaks did occur, and we anticipated back as early as 2014, President Obama spoke about a potential likelihood of a pandemic, that they would be able to respond since time is of the essence. And then data collection and the integrity of the data collection. And I know that there's been a lot of tension between the politics and the evidence, but if you could just speak to a moment about what Congress can do to make sure that we are actually collecting the data that shows the disparities, shows the need, shows the impact that this is having on different communities, And so just as President Obama put into the Affordable Care Act funds to study health disparities and with the hope that we would then close those gaps, what can Congress do to make sure that we are actually collecting the data that we need that will then inform the policy decisions that you as legislators make down the line?
Right. I mean, I just do want to say this. The things that you all as an administration put in place were so prescient. You saw what was about to happen without knowing that it would, but you knew that the government should be there for the people in a moment of crisis, and for that reason should have the vision to prepare for crisis so that we can meet the moment where it exists. Sadly, however, the administration after you got rid of so much of what you created. And so there has been a lack of preparedness as well as a lack of embrace of truth, science, and fact. And I bring that up because Congress can only do so much if there is not each branch of government working together with a collective purpose of meeting the moment of crisis with an embrace of fact and truth. That being said, we're still going to keep fighting. So it's about data collection, to your point. It's about doing what we need to do to also understand long-standing disparities and speak truth about that. Again, work that your administration did. So speaking truth about the fact that COVID it attacks the respiratory system. Well, you know, and most people should know, that of everyone in our country who lives in a district with poor air quality, 70% are people of color. Compound that with the fact that pre-existing conditions, something that you addressed with the Affordable Care Act, which is that shouldn't be a barrier to getting access to health care, pre-existing conditions, in particular among Black and brown people, are so extreme based on long-standing disparities that they are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and the coronavirus. Why? Because the virus is predatory and it attacks people who have pre-existing conditions and are therefore not as healthy and strong. And so, again, collection of data about not only where is the pandemic hitting in terms of who is contracting the disease, but also who has longstanding disparities that make them vulnerable to it, so that, again, we can get the resources to the communities that need them. And I'll add that if the data collection has to be done in a thoughtful way that includes the collection of data by people who know the community and are culturally competent. There needs to be an analysis of the data by people who are culturally competent so that the result of that process will be relevant to the communities that need it.
Exactly. So I just have 1.5 more questions before we let you go. And I know how busy you are, Senator, but I know that you and Congressman Ayanna Pressley recently teamed up on a Save Our Streets initiative. So if you could tell our viewers a little bit about that.
I'm really excited to work with her. She's phenomenal. One of the newly electeds in 2018 from Massachusetts. So essentially, Saving Our Streets is about saving the business down the street. Could be the bodega, the barbershop, the beauty salon, the florist, and realizing that those businesses usually are not going to be banked. They're not going to have lines of credit with the big banks. They may work with the community bank, but they don't have the kind of relationship so that when we have things like the Paycheck Protection Program that's supposed to give them relief, they're not first in line. And in fact, sadly, they've been last in line. In fact, as it relates to the PPP, 90% of women and small-owned businesses did not get PPP because they don't have those relationships. And it's just unfair, it's wrong, it furthers the inequities that exist. So here's what we're proposing. That under the Saving Our Streets program, businesses that have 10 and fewer employees will be targeted with $125 billion to be first in line to get up to $250,000 to help save their businesses. Why? Because those are the same businesses that are the lifeblood of the community. Those are the businesses that when the child in the neighborhood says, I need somebody to sponsor me for the softball team, they write the check. Those are the businesses that you during this pandemic, somebody says, I just lost my job, and they give them a line of credit. These are the businesses where these owners of these businesses are not only business leaders, they're civic leaders, they're community leaders, and we cannot let them fall through the cracks. We cannot let them perish. They are so integral to the fabric of the community. So that's what that bill is about.
It's a terrific initiative. So
Thank
now,
you.
Senator, on more of a personal note, a lot of folks who are watching live and who I know will also watch later online, not only respect you, they just love you. And so I know they want to know, how are you doing? And how is your family doing? You've had quite a year, and you're fighting a good fight out there on behalf of not just your constituents in California, but the country. But how are you finding, in the hopes that as they're listening to your words, they can find inspiration in their own lives? How are you keeping yourself well, and how are you doing?
Thank you, and thank you. And every time I see you, you ask that question from the heart, and that's one of the many things that's so special about you.
Well, you're in the arena.
You know,
I know it's not easy.
But listen, I feel very blessed. I have to tell you. I mean, when 1 in 5 mothers in America is describing her children who are under the age of 12 as being hungry, I'm great. When you look at almost 40 million people who just lost their jobs within the last 100 days, I'm great. I feel very, very fortunate, and you know, and to get through it, it's about being in touch with friends, and you know, I've been saying it, and picking up the phone when you can, because listening to somebody's laugh is so much better than reading LOL. You know, right?
Yes.
And I love to cook, so I've been cooking a lot. But you know, listen, we all should. And I know we do, take these moments in the midst of a crisis to count our blessings, and also to renew our commitment to our neighbors who we're not necessarily seeing in person, but we know they're there. And even if we don't see them physically, let's see them in terms of their needs and fight for them.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. And I think, as a mom myself, I'm always saying to the next younger generation, texting is okay, but I'd rather see your face and hear your, you know, I can tell within 5 seconds if you're okay or if you're not. And I spend a lot more time on FaceTime with my friends and family too than I ever used to. So in a way, this trauma that has touched the hearts and lives of so many Americans has also brought us closer together, and that's what gives me hope. And I know it's what gives you hope too. Senator, I just can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us. I know you're busy. I know you're out there fighting the good fight. And it gives us such a pleasure to be able to highlight women who are out there on the front lines, doing the work that needs to be done, leading by example. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for
all right. You be well, my friend.
You be well. Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.